This morning, a celebration of pride as the gay community commemorates the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising that sparked a revolution of change.
Now, from 42nd and 2nd, this is Pix 11 News Close-Up with Marvin Scott.
Good morning. The month of June is a time to celebrate the darkest and the brightest hour for this country's gay rights movement. Millions turned out to commemorate the 50th anniversary of what has come to be known as the Stonewall Uprising, a night police used excessive force to clamp down on gays who decided to fight back, and in doing so transformed days of protest into a worldwide movement. It all began in a lively bar in Greenwich Village.
The Stonewall Inn was a sanctuary for the city's gay community, a safe haven for homosexuals, lesbians, drag queens, a place where they could be free of ridicule in a city that criminalized acts of homosexuality.
This was a refuge. It was a safe place. It was the only place we can go.
Mark Siegel was 18 years old in 1969, a newcomer to the city. He was gay and alone until he found Stonewall.
When you went into Stonewall, you could hold hands, you could kiss, and more importantly, for an 18-year-old like me, you could dance.
Police made regular visits to Stonewall, owned by the mob and operating without a liquor license. But in the early hours of June 28, 1969, they arrived with a vengeance.
What made that night different than all others, which created the spark, when they came in, they burst in. When they came in, they slammed people up against the wall.
Things got out of hand when patrons said they had had enough and fought back. Someone threw a glass at a mirror.
No one knows who threw what when. We were a crowd. It was spontaneous. It was a riot.
Police made 13 arrests as the chaos spilled out onto the streets, the crowd fighting back, with 15 police officers cowering for safety inside Stonewall.
We were all across here, across the street. The police were locked in the bar. We picked up whatever we could from that street. Stones, so you'll see things in the street. That's what we did. Whatever was there, we reached for.
The riots became protests. The protests became a movement.
Absolutely made life easier. We walk on the shoulders of a lot of people who came before us, did a lot of hard work.
On the first anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, there were gay rights parades. A year later, gay rights groups were formed in almost every major city.
You can't make us go away!
The gay rights movement has made some major strides over the past 5 decades.
Gay legislation in many states and cities across the country to end discrimination, marriage equality, gays in the military.
Police were widely criticized for their actions that fateful night 50 years ago. This year, the gay community got an apology.
The actions and the laws were discriminatory and oppressive, and for that, I apologize.
President Obama memorialized the struggle for gay rights by designating the Stonewall National Monument, where the modern-day movement began.
The name Stonewall is permanently embedded in the gay community's vocabulary to mean taking a stance against oppression and demanding equality in all aspects of life. Our thanks to the Smithsonian Channel for the use of some of the video from their documentary Beyond Stonewall, which will air next on July 4th. I'm now pleased to be joined by Cathy Renna, an LGBTQ activist and the spokesperson for Pride. Mark Horn is also an activist who was part of the leadership of the gay youth movement, and he played a role in the first Gay Pride. Welcome. Good to have you with us. What was it about Stonewall that was so instrumental in bringing about all this change we have seen over the past 5 decades?
Well, I mean, I think we can agree what it did was it really sparked the larger movement. I mean, there were protests happening prior, but they were more staged. There were pickets in front of the White House in 1965, pickets in Philadelphia every year at the 4th of July by groups like the Mattachine Society and others. But this was really the kind of uprising where those most marginalized in our community said, we've had enough, you know?
I mean, these were people who had nothing to lose. And it was also the time, this was the late 60s, was the time of the anti-war movement. It was the height of the civil rights movement. It was the height of the women's rights movement. Yeah. So when you have all these things going on together, these things were sort of like the the match. Everybody was already on edge, and when the raid happened, everybody was already primed to fight back because we were all, all of us were involved in the anti-war movement. We were involved in all of these
Now,
things.
police showed up regularly to pick up some cash off the counter.
Yes.
But what was it that brought them out that particular night on June 28th?
This is a good question. There's some discussion and differences of opinion about what happened. Usually it would be the 6th precinct, which would be doing that kind of raid because the bar was in their area. But this was Midtown South, which had done the raid, and it was, and the 6th precinct didn't know about it. It's possible that they were not actually there to collect money. Because the 6th precinct was the one that took the money. Midtown South really did a raid.
Now, I found it very interesting in looking in the background that these bars, Stonewall as well as other gay bars, were owned by members of the mob.
Yeah.
And no liquor licenses.
No, I mean, it was illegal at the time to serve a drink to someone who was openly gay.
I saw a picture of a bartender putting his hand over a glass refusing to serve someone.
Yep.
So much has happened in the years from that. It gave rise to the gay rights movement. What do you see as the greatest accomplishment in the past 50 years?
I mean, I worked for so many years, and I worked primarily in media and visibility issues. And I think media and visibility has been really one of our greatest accomplishments. I mean,
the visibility.
Yeah, I mean, as Mark and those who stood up and said, we want to be seen. And I think if you look, you turn on the TV, you read the newspaper, or you talk to anyone, no one in this country and no one really around the world can say they don't know someone who's LGBT. And because of that visibility, we were able to push forth and make some progress. We have marriage equality, as Mark was saying in the segment that you showed. We've repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We have, half the states in this country you can't be fired for being LGBT, but half of them you can. And we've made progress in many different areas.
But also the definition of being gay. Back then, the American Psychiatric Association said it was a mental disorder.
Until 1973,
and unacceptable.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, well, actually, so there were heroes within that profession as well who stood up and said. So previously, we were talking about visibility. No one was willing to go on television and say, "I'm gay." On the David Susskind show, people showed up with bags on their head, right, because they could be fired. But post Stonewall, people were standing up and saying, I have the right to be who I am. And in the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, finally, gay psychologists and psychiatrists started to come out and be public and say, hey, pardon me, but we are not mentally ill. We are, in fact, quite well adjusted, and this is a bad diagnosis.
So it has taken half a century for attitudes to change. But there's still a lot more ahead to do.
There's a lot to do. I mean, the reality is, especially in the last few years, we've seen increase in spike in hate crimes. We continue to see discrimination, not even just against LGBT people, but different religions, people of color, women. Trans women of color, in particular, are very, very targeted. There's really an epidemic of violence against them. Again, we said this before. Half the states in this country, you can still be fired for being part of the LGBT community.
Let's explore that a little further. Let's
Sure.
take a break. We'll be right back and continue talking about our celebration of Pride. We'll be right back. While the Stonewall Inn was a safe haven for homosexuals, lesbians, and drag queens, it wasn't their only refuge in Greenwich Village. The Julius Bar on West 10th Street remains the oldest continually operating gay bar in the city. Alicia Nieves recently dropped in for a visit.
Julius has been open for more than a century and is still very popular.
I feel like it's community-based, I feel like it's relaxed, I feel like it's inclusive.
What this bar is today for many in the LGBTQ community is very different from what it once was.
So many bars were places of oppression, and today they have changed meaning over time.
In the 1960s, the bar had a practice of discriminating against openly gay people. Such discrimination was documented in this photo.
This was taken April 21st, 1966 by Village Voice photographer Fred McDara, and it captures when Dick Leitch announced we are homosexuals, we want to be served, and the bartender put his hand over the glass and said, nope, I'm sorry.
Many historians refer to the infamous Stonewall riots as the start of the equal rights movement for the LGBTQ community, but the sip-in at Julius happened 3 years before Stonewall.
People know maybe a little about Stonewall. There was a riot and then gay liberation, right? But they don't know about the steps before. That event was sort of a tipping point for the community.
From sip-ins here at Julius in 1966 to Stonewall in 69 to now, 2019, equal rights for those in the LGBT community have come a long way. Pride Month celebrates that history made and the history yet to be made for many in the LGBTQ communities. In Greenwich Village, Alicia Nieves, Pix 11 News.
Back now with Cathy Renna and Mark Horn talking about Pride and the advances over the past 50 years since the Stonewall Uprising. This year, now you're the spokesperson for Pride, but this has been going on for almost 2 decades now, but this year is different from the previous years. What makes it different?
This year is extremely special. New York is just thrilled to be the host of the first World Pride held in the United States. I mean, it's been held in other cities, Madrid, Toronto, Rome, and it brings the world together. I mean, we are a global community, and I think it's really important, particularly now, it's happening at the same time as the Stonewall 50 commemoration, to have a platform where we can say we're still here, we're still visible, there's still work to do, there are diverse parts of our community that still need, help, support, and to fight against discrimination that is still happening.
In fact, a very important part about World Pride and a very important issue in the United States today is the question of refugees. There are so many LGBT immigrants and refugees who seek asylum or seek safety in the United States. And this is a country which has obviously historically welcomed immigrants, and there are many countries where it is extremely dangerous to be out as an LGBT person. So that the United States offers a sanctuary, except of course today with the climate about immigration, it's really very difficult. So it's very important for us in this World Pride celebration to really make the stand to be open as a safe haven for LGBT people from around the world who are escaping oppression and possibly even death.
Well, there are countries today that will imprison someone who is found to be homosexual.
Or execute
even
them.
Punishable by death.
Yes, Saudi Arabia, for example.
For example, I mean, when we did our opening ceremony for World Pride, it was a benefit concert, and one of the organizations was Immigration Equality. They're doing extraordinary work trying to help folks who are looking for asylum in the United States. And it's become more difficult because, as Mark was saying, under the current political administration, the climate, it's really been a challenge.
Now let's go back. What happened on June 28, 1969 was a benchmark really for the whole movement. As I said, riots led to protests, led to a movement. And one of the first was the Gay Liberation Front, and then there was a youth caucus, which you were part of.
Yes. So the youth, gay youth, so the Gay Liberation Front was the organization which literally formed in the ashes of the Stonewall. Within 24 hours, people who became the founders of GLF were meeting in front of the Stonewall and speaking to the crowd and organizing a political action group. So that within a month, there was the first demonstration from the village, from basically Sheridan Square to Washington Square. A few months later, there was a protest march in Times Square. And then a year later, it was the very first Christopher Street Liberation Day Pride March.
Now, so much has happened. I mean, you fought for so many years for marriage equality. The Supreme Court has upheld the right for same-sex marriages, but it is not totally as it would appear on the surface, is it?
Well, certainly not. I mean, one of the things is that while we have marriage equality, we don't have our full civil rights. So that while you can get married in any state in this union, the next day, if your employer finds out, depending on who they are, you could be fired.
Absolutely.
And we have no protections for that because we're not covered under the civil rights legislation.
Now, you expressed to me earlier during the break that there is also the fear that this could be challenged before the Supreme Court.
Oh, definitely. Just as Roe versus Wade and abortion rights are being challenged in the courts, and they're slowly moving their way up to the Supreme Court. There are people who want to sort of push back on gay rights, and we'll seek to overturn marriage equality as well. And really, it's extremely important because this is not a struggle that is over or perhaps will ever be over. We have to be very vigilant in order to keep our rights and to actually further our agenda.
Now, you were in the leadership early on with the forming of the organizations, and people slowly joined. What was the difficulty back in those days to get people to come out and say, I am gay?
Well, you know, even much more so than today. You know, you could be fired from your job, you could be denied insurance, your family would throw you out, you would be rejected by your faith community. There were all kinds of ways that you would end up basically without any emotional support, family support, societal support, so that you could end up on the street, and many people did, which is why in a bar like the Stonewall, you saw many people who were homeless street kids. They had been thrown out by their families.
Now, in interviewing people at the Stonewall, people said that we walked on the shoulders of giants, that so much has been achieved, that this one person said, just talking to me in the interview was something that never would have happened 50 years ago. Standing here and admitting that he was a homosexual, this was not 50 years ago, you'd wind up in jail.
Well, I mean, I think it's exactly what Mark's saying. And I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I do if it wasn't for what Mark Siegel and everyone else did, whether it was Mattachine or whether it was the Gay Liberation Front. And we're dealing with a lot of the same issues still. I mean, again, when I talked about the opening ceremony for World Pride, another beneficiary was the Ali Fernet Center. They work with homeless LGBTQ youth here in New York City to provide housing because their parents throw them out. This is still happening every day across this country. And so while we have made a tremendous amount of progress, there's still a lot of work to do, particularly in the communities of those most marginalized. And I think that's one of the big messages that we hope to get out, not just in the march, but in all the events that we're doing for this whole month around both World Pride and Stonewall.
Let's take a break. Let's talk more about that.
Sure.
What has to be done, what is being done. Stay with us as we celebrate World Pride. In some religions, members of the gay community are considered outcasts and unwelcome in congregations. But attitudes, they are changing, and some churches are building better bonds with the LGBT community. Ayanna Harry visited one house of worship in Manhattan that is embracing homosexuals and lesbians.
An oasis on 2nd Avenue. This is Middle Collegiate Church, where diverse voices sing together and diverse New Yorkers have found a home.
I hadn't heard that God loved me as a queer person before I came in these doors.
We're working on a love revolution, and we want everyone to join it.
Reverend Jacqueline Lewis leads the faith community here. Middle Church is both historic and progressive.
Middle Church is having an impact in the world. Thank you, God.
Established in the 1620s, Middle Church found a new purpose in the 1980s as crisis rocked the LGBT residents here in the Lower East Side. Middle Church did what many others would not. They performed funerals for New Yorkers who died with AIDS.
That's the beginning of our progression around LGBT justice.
This is me. 30 years later, and Middle Church remains on the forefront, advocating for queer New Yorkers.
You can use the Bible to make LGBTQ people think that they are an abomination and not of God, and that is simply not true.
Graham Bridgman is the first openly transgender deacon.
And it was really amazing. Getting to stand in front of people and go to scripture and then bring back a word for them.
This June, Middle Church is boldly celebrating Pride. Yesterday's service was filled with personal testimonies.
We hide in straight spaces because they are often not safe for queer people.
And they're not the only house of worship embracing Pride. More conservative faiths like the Catholic Church are also building better bonds with the LGBTQ community. Father James Martin is a Jesuit priest.
I think things are softening for LGBT Catholics. In New York, for example, I think it's very strong. LGBT Catholics feel welcome in the church. In other dioceses and cities, it's not so strong.
Back at Middle Collegiate Church, Pride isn't just for the month of June. It's fundamental to who they are. Ayana Harry, Pix 11 News.
Certainly uplifting, but it's not, every church does not welcome the LGBT community.
Well, the Methodist Church very recently went through a major schism. Yeah, really a schism over accepting LGBTQ people. And so, you know, you had Methodist churches that were putting out extremely supportive messages and signs saying, we welcome you, we embrace you, and others that were not. And it's a real, you know, it's a challenge. The Episcopal Church went through a very, very similar struggle not too long ago, and is now in a very different place. And I vividly remember when they ordained the first, or consecrated the first openly gay bishop, Bishop Gene Robinson. He wore a bulletproof vest underneath his vestments because he was worried about what might happen. And now, years later, I think what we're seeing is queer people of faith are coming out and saying, you know what, I'm not going to walk away from this church. And so from within are trying to create the openness and the acceptance that you're talking
from
about.
the soundbite we heard that said that the Catholic Church seems to be softening its position.
The Catholic Church is not softening its position. I was raised Catholic, and I worked a lot on issues related to the scandals in the church where they tried to blame particularly gay priests for things that were happening and abuse towards kids. And this Pope, who I really had hoped would be better, very recently came out with some extremely transphobic remarks and comments and canon. And it's really extremely disappointing as someone who was raised Catholic.
Now, there have been so many advances since that fateful night in 1969, but yet many inequalities still exist. Where do you go from here?
Oh, well, we keep fighting and we keep doing the work because the work is never done. Just as we need to pass civil rights legislation in the Congress in order to protect our rights from being fired. And just as, you know, there are people who want to establish what I'll call religious bigotry, right? You know, there are people saying, well, I'm practicing my religion, so I can't serve you. Well, I'm sorry, that's just flat out discrimination. That is the establishment of religious practice by the state. It is sanctioned religious practice by the state, but we live in a secular country. There is no established religion, and all of us have our rights. I'm not against anybody practicing their religion, but that doesn't mean they get, if they have a business, a public business, they can't not serve me.
And Cathy, where do you see going forward now?
Well, you know, I have a lot of hope. I work with a lot of young people, and I think they are coming into a generation where they don't necessarily put people in boxes. We're seeing a lot more fluidity around gender, around sexuality, a lot more openness, a lot more just seeing people as people. However, Mark's absolutely right. What we need is the institutional change, whether it is getting law enforcement to do a better job in how they treat LGBT people. I mean, I appreciated the apology by the commissioner, but it doesn't make up for decades of mistreatment and some that
ongoing
that continues.
Yes.
Exactly, that's right. And, you know, we need to pass the Equality Act for the millions who are in states where they could be fired. And I've been saying this really in every interview I've been doing for months now. We really, really need to get together and find a way to support our trans siblings, particularly around issues of discrimination and violence.
As we end the program, I want to go back to what you said at the very opening. One of the greatest accomplishments is the visibility.
Absolutely.
You no longer have to be shielded or be invisible. You can come out and say you are a member of the LGBT community.
Which, if that's safe, I completely
support. What Harvey Milk said was that if every gay or lesbian person came out tomorrow, everything would change, because every family has an LGBT person involved. So that if all of us were out, the entire world would see that we are in fact everywhere. We are your fathers, your sisters, your mothers, we are your cousins, your uncles. We are embedded in this country, and this connection is really important, and everyone would support us if they knew.
A lot to celebrate World Pride. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thank you.
Cathy Renna and Mark Horn.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for our program for this week. If you have any comments or wish to see this broadcast again, log on to our website at pix11.com/newscloseup. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone.